A cowboy rescued a woman from snow, then discovered she was carrying his future child. James Walker tightened his grip on the reins as the snowstorm battered against him. The wind howled through the hills, and the snowflakes were sharp, stinging his face like thousands of tiny needles. His hat, pulled low over his brow, offered little protection from the biting cold. The familiar landscape of his ranch had disappeared beneath the thick blanket of white, and all he could see was a world turned gray and swirling. He'd been out on his horse for hours, checking on the cattle, making sure they were safe from the worst of the storm. The herd had already moved into the shelter of the trees, and the cabin wasn't far off, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The storm had worsened since he left, and the visibility was near zero. He knew he had to head back to the cabin soon. He wasn't about to risk his own safety, not in weather this fierce. Then, just as he turned the horse's head toward home, something caught his ear, faint but distinct. It was a muffled cry, soft and fragile, like the whimper of an animal. James instinctively slowed the horse. His heart rate quickened as he strained to hear it again. The wind gusted fiercely, almost drowning the sound, but there it was again, a desperate cry, weak but unmistakable. He urged the horse forward, following the sound through the thickening storm. He couldn't see much, but there was something out of place just ahead. The snow had drifted in strange patterns, and in the middle of it, a figure lay half buried, barely moving. His stomach tightened. Jumping off the horse, he hurried over to the person, barely feeling his frozen fingers as he scraped the snow away. He thought at first it might be an animal, maybe a deer caught in the storm. But as more snow was cleared away, the unmistakable shape of a person began to emerge. She was a woman, unconscious and completely exposed to the cold, her body half buried in the snow. Her clothes were soaked, and her skin was pale, the tips of her fingers and nose already beginning to turn blue. "Hey! Hey, you!" James called, his voice sharp in the storm. But there was no response. She didn't stir. His heart raced as he quickly knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he checked for signs of life. She was breathing, but it was shallow, her chest rising and falling slowly. Panic gripped him for a moment as he realized how close she was to freezing. He couldn't waste time. He had to get her out of here, and fast. With all the strength he could muster, James lifted the woman into his arms, cradling her against him. She was light, her body limp, and he felt the chill of her skin seep into his own. His mind raced. There was no way he could carry her the whole way back to the cabin on foot, not with this storm howling around them. He had to think fast. His horse, still standing nearby, stamped its hooves against the cold ground, as if ready to be of help. James moved quickly, laying the woman carefully across the horse's back. He grabbed the reins with one hand and gently held her in place with the other. "Easy, girl," he muttered to the horse, who gave a quiet snort, almost as if understanding. The animal was already familiar with the harsh weather, but this was different. It wasn't just a winter storm, it was life or death. As they made their way through the snow, the wind began to scream even louder, and the snow fell harder, making it nearly impossible to see. James kept his head low, his eyes focused on the path ahead, trusting the horse to guide them. The woman's body seemed heavier with every step, as though the storm itself was trying to hold them back. But James wasn't about to stop. It felt like forever before they finally reached the cabin, but eventually the familiar shape of the small, weathered structure appeared through the thick snow. He quickly led the horse to the barn, tying it up with quick, practiced motions. Then he moved to the woman. His breath was coming out in visible clouds, his body aching from the cold. The wind howled and roared, but the cabin at least would offer some shelter. He carried the woman inside, where the warmth of the fire greeted him, crackling and spitting in the hearth. James gently set her down on the nearest chair, his mind already going into action mode. He dealt with cattle in the snow, and the harsh winters of the ranch had taught him how to survive, but this was different. A human life was at risk, and he wasn't going to let her slip away. The storm raged outside, but inside he could at least feel some relief. He worked quickly to start a fire, piling more wood into the hearth. The warmth soon spread, but he knew it would take time for her body temperature to return to normal. He had to act fast, or the freezing temperatures could claim her life. James grabbed the blanket from his bed, wrapping it around her tightly, rubbing her arms and legs gently to try and get the blood flowing again. He didn't want to disturb her too much, but the more he worked, the more he realized how vulnerable she was. There was no telling how long she had been out in the storm. She began to stir after a while, a soft groan escaping her lips. Slowly, her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him with confusion. Her gaze was cloudy, unfocused. What happened? She murmured. You're safe now, James said, trying to offer comfort. He wasn't sure how much she could understand in her state, but he wanted her to feel that she was no longer alone. You were lost in the snow. I found you. You're at my cabin. Her eyes slowly focused on him, and her brow furrowed, as if trying to make sense of his words. The storm outside roared like a wild animal, but inside there was warmth. For a moment, the danger was gone. You saved me, she whispered, her voice weak. James gave a small nod, his face softening. I did what I could. Just rest now. You're safe here. But as the woman drifted in and out of consciousness, James couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would change more than just her life. It would change his as well. For now, the immediate danger was over, but James had a sense that their meeting wasn't just a twist of fate. It was the beginning of something that neither of them could fully understand yet. He didn't know who she was, or how she had ended up out there in the snow, but something inside him told him he had a role to play in her life from here on out. As the storm continued to howl outside, James sat by the fire, keeping watch over the stranger he had rescued, wondering what the days ahead would bring. James had thought the woman would be unconscious for much longer, but to his surprise, she woke up not long after he had wrapped her in blankets and started the fire. Her eyes flickered open slowly as though they were adjusting to the warmth of the cabin after the cold grip of the storm. Her skin was still pale from the freezing temperatures, but there was a subtle color returning to her cheeks, and her breathing was deeper now. For a moment, she seemed confused, her gaze drifting around the room as if unsure where she was. Her brow furrowed, and her eyes finally focused on James. He was sitting in the chair across from her, just watching over her, his face soft but concerned. The fire crackled in the background, its warmth a sharp contrast to the harsh weather outside. "Where am I?" Her voice was soft and weak, barely above a whisper. She cleared her throat gently before trying again. "What happened?" "You're at my cabin," James answered. His tone was calm, reassuring. "You were caught in the snowstorm. I found you outside, nearly frozen. I brought you in to warm up." Her eyes widened, the memory beginning to flood back. She glanced down at her hands, noticing the coldness still lingering in her fingers. She shivered, despite the heat from the fire, and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "How long was I out there?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Long enough for the storm to get worse," James replied, his gaze fixed on her. "You were lucky I found you when I did." She took a slow, deep breath, trying to process what had happened. The storm had hit so suddenly, and she had been so unprepared. She didn't remember exactly how she ended up outside, only the overwhelming cold and the feeling of being lost. Her head ached as she recalled the fragments of what had occurred before she had collapsed. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes meeting his with gratitude. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." James offered a small smile, nodding. "I'm just glad I found you when I did. The storm's bad out there. It would have been easy to get lost." The woman's gaze wandered, taking in the cozy cabin around her. It was a small, modest place with wooden beams on the ceiling and a fire that crackled merrily in the hearth. The room was dimly lit, but the warmth and smell of wood burning gave it a peaceful, safe feel. She could tell that James had lived here for some time. The cabin was simple but well kept. There was a small kitchen area with a wooden table, and beside the fire a cot with a thick quilt spread across it. She felt strange in this unfamiliar place, but somehow comforted by the quiet, the shelter from the storm, and the kindness in his eyes. "How can I repay you for this?" she asked, her voice steady now, though still tinged with awe at his unexpected help. James shook his head, waving his hand as if the idea of repayment was unnecessary. You don't owe me anything. I did what anyone would have done in the same situation. She studied him carefully, taking in his strong features and the quiet way he carried himself. His dark eyes were full of kindness, but there was something about him that made her think he wasn't a man who showed much emotion easily. His cowboy nature was evident. He had the build of a man who had worked hard with his hands and spent countless hours in the open air. His rough hands and worn clothes told a story of long days spent on a ranch, with no room for luxury or comfort. "I don't even know your name," she said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "James," he replied simply, his voice low but warm. "I'm Evelyn," she said, offering him a small smile. "Thank you, James." "Evelyn," he repeated, as if trying to remember it. "You're welcome." For a few moments, the two of them just sat there in the warm glow of the fire, neither saying much. The storm outside was still relentless, the wind howling against the cabin, but in here there was a quiet peace. Evelyn could feel the tension slowly leaving her body as the warmth seeped in, but as much as she wanted to relax, her mind was full of questions. "I don't remember much," she began, her voice quieter now. "How did you find me?" "I must have been so out of it," James glanced at her, his eyes thoughtful. "I was out on horseback checking on the cattle," he explained. "The storm came up fast, and I knew I had to get back to the cabin. That's when I heard you. At first I thought it was an animal, but then I realized it was you. You were half buried in the snow." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as she imagined the situation. She had been so close to death, so close to losing everything in the storm. She didn't know how long she'd been lost or what had kept her moving through the snow. But now in the warmth of this cabin, she realized how lucky she had been.
"How did you know where to find me?" she asked, still puzzled.
James looked out the small window for a moment, his face serious. "I know these hills like the back of my hand," he said, his voice rough but full of confidence. "I've lived here my whole life. When you're out here in weather like this, you learn to trust your instincts." Evelyn nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude that she couldn't quite put into words. She had never met anyone like James before. He was a stranger, but he had saved her life without hesitation, and now here he was sitting with her, offering shelter from the storm. Her thoughts wandered, and she found herself wondering who he was, what had brought him out here to this isolated place. She had never met a man like him, someone so self-reliant, so calm in the face of danger. But Evelyn wasn't sure how much to ask him, how much he might be willing to share. "You said you were checking on the cattle?" she said after a pause, her curiosity getting the better of her. "Is this your ranch?" "Yeah," James replied. "I've got a small spread just up the hill. Been working it for years. I mostly take care of cattle, but I've got a few horses too." He didn't elaborate further, but Evelyn could tell it was something he took pride in. There was a sense of ownership in the way he spoke, like his ranch and the land were a part of him. "That sounds like hard work," Evelyn remarked, her voice soft. James gave a small chuckle. "It's a lot of work, but it's honest work. Keeps me busy, keeps me out of trouble." Evelyn smiled, grateful for his easygoing nature. "I can imagine. You seem like the kind of person who's used to taking care of things." He nodded but didn't say much else. There was something about James, something guarded, that told Evelyn he didn't share much about himself unless he had to. She didn't push him, though. She wasn't here to dig into his life. She had her own reasons for wanting to keep her past hidden. The silence between them stretched, comfortable but filled with unspoken words. Evelyn leaned back, staring into the fire as she let the warmth soak into her bones. "You're safe here," James said quietly, breaking the silence. "The storm's bad out there. We'll wait it out." Evelyn nodded, feeling a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. She wasn't sure how long she would stay or what the next step would be. But for now, in this moment, she was safe. And that was enough. As the days passed, the storm outside gradually weakened, but the heavy snow didn't seem to want to stop. It covered the landscape like a thick white blanket, and the world outside felt distant, as though it were completely cut off from the cabin. Inside, the air was warm and the crackling fire continued to burn steadily, providing both light and comfort. Evelyn spent most of her time resting, trying to regain her strength after the ordeal. She had been weakened by the cold, her body sore and tired. James had given her space to rest, but he was always nearby, taking care of the small tasks around the cabin, feeding the fire, checking on the horses, and making sure there was enough firewood. She could hear him moving around in the next room, his steady footsteps a reminder that, for the moment, she was safe. Each time she woke up, he was there. The first time she fully regained her strength, she had found him sitting beside her, reading a book by the fire. It seemed like a simple gesture, but it made her feel a warmth that went beyond the heat of the fire. She hadn't been around people much, certainly not like this, and it was strange, comforting to know that someone cared enough to stay close. Evelyn tried to sit up as she slowly gained strength. She was still feeling the effects of the storm's cold, and the warmth of the cabin was still so welcome, but there was something that kept her restless. She felt like she owed James something, but she wasn't sure what. She didn't even know how she could begin to repay him. He hadn't asked for anything in return, but the feeling that she needed to do something lingered. One afternoon, as the snowstorm had finally begun to calm, she sat by the window watching the snow fall silently outside. The wind had settled, and the world seemed quieter than before. Evelyn found herself staring out at the endless white, her thoughts drifting. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked softly, not turning to face him. James was sitting at the table nearby, sharpening a knife with a slow, steady motion. He paused, looking up at her as though he had been lost in thought too. He set the knife down and gave her a thoughtful look before answering. "Tired of what?" "Of being out here all alone," Evelyn replied. She felt a little embarrassed asking, but it had been on her mind ever since she arrived. She didn't know much about James, just what little he had shared. His life here, isolated and quiet, was so different from her own. She had spent her life surrounded by people, always in the middle of something, always caught up in the noise and bustle of the world, but James seemed so at peace here, so comfortable. James considered her question for a moment, his face unreadable. Finally he spoke. "It's not so bad. I grew up out here. I've always known it's where I belong." He paused as if choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes I'll get lonely, sure, but that's not something I can change. This is the life I know." Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes tracing the gentle falling snow outside.
"I get that," she said quietly.
"I've always been around people, surrounded by noise. I never thought I'd end up here, in a place so quiet." Her voice was softer now, a little unsure. She wasn't sure why she was sharing this with him. She didn't know him well, but somehow it felt easier to talk to him than to anyone else. James didn't answer immediately, but after a moment he spoke again, his voice low. "The quiet's something you get used to, and it's not always as lonely as people think." He looked at her, his dark eyes steady. "The land has a way of making you feel connected to something bigger. You don't have to talk to feel understood." Evelyn felt a flicker of something in his words, something deeper. It was clear that he had a connection to this place, to the land itself, a connection she couldn't quite understand. She had always thought that silence meant emptiness, that being alone meant something was missing. But maybe, just maybe, James was right. Maybe there was something in this silence, something she hadn't known she needed. The days began to blend together as Evelyn rested and regained her strength. Every now and then, James would share a bit more about his life, how he had grown up on the ranch, how he had learned to survive in these mountains, how he took pride in the work he did, but always in small, simple pieces. He didn't seem to be one for long explanations or personal stories, and Evelyn didn't press. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a quiet respect. She knew he had his own reasons for keeping things to himself, just as she did. One evening, after a long day of snow clearing and feeding the horses, James finally broke the silence that had hung between them. He turned to Evelyn, his eyes more serious than she had seen them before. "I think it's time for you to head out," he said, his voice calm but firm. Evelyn blinked, not sure she had heard him correctly. She hadn't expected this. She had known that the storm would pass eventually, but hearing it out loud, hearing James say it, made her feel a mix of emotions she wasn't prepared for. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice a little unsure. I thought I could stay here until the storm completely clears." James nodded, his face steady, but there was something else in his eyes. Something like concern. "The storm's done! The roads won't be perfect, but it's safe enough to go now. I've got my ranch to take care of, and you've got your own life to return to." Evelyn felt a pang in her chest. She didn't want to leave, not just yet. She had grown accustomed to this place, to the quiet, and to James's company. She knew she wasn't ready to go back to the world outside, where everything felt chaotic and uncertain. But the reality of it hit her like a wave. She had to move on. She couldn't stay here forever. And James had his life to lead, too. She couldn't rely on his kindness for too long. I don't know what to say," she admitted softly, her eyes downcast. James stood up from the table and walked over to the window, glancing out at the fading light of the evening. "You don't need to say anything. It's just time." Evelyn didn't know what to feel. Part of her was relieved, like a weight had been lifted. But another part of her wanted to stay, to find comfort in this strange, quiet world that James had created for himself. She wasn't ready to leave him, not yet. But she knew he was right. She couldn't stay here forever. "I guess I understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just don't want to go back to what's out there." His expression softer now. "The world's always going to be loud, always going to have its chaos, but you've got a choice in how you handle it. Don't let it take away what you've found." His words settled over her like a blanket, warm and comforting. Evelyn met his gaze, her chest tight. "Thank you, James," she said quietly. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "You would have found your way. You... The silence that followed was comfortable. There were no more words needed. Both of them knew that things were changing, and that the time for decisions had come. Evelyn wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while she felt like she could face it, no matter what came next. Evelyn stood at the window, her hands pressed against the cool glass as she looked out at the snow-covered landscape. The sky was overcast, and the snowflakes fell slowly, almost lazily, as if the world itself were taking a breath. Everything around her was peaceful, silent, and still, but inside she felt a storm of emotions building. James had told her it was time to leave, and she knew he was right. The storm had passed, and life on the ranch needed to move forward. But leaving felt like tearing away from something that had started to feel like home. For the first time since arriving, Evelyn wondered about the choices she had made, about her life and where it was headed. She had come here in search of something, though she hadn't been sure what. Now, standing at the edge of leaving, she realized that she wasn't just leaving the cabin or the comfort of the fire. She was leaving something much deeper. She was leaving the quiet connection she had started to build with James. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard the sound of boots approaching behind her. It was James! He was walking with his usual steady pace, but today there was a slight heaviness in his steps. When he reached her, he didn't say anything right away. Instead, he stood next to her, both of them staring out into the distance. The wind had died down, but the cold still lingered in the air, biting at their skin. "Do you ever feel like you're trapped in your own choices?" Evelyn asked quietly, almost as if she hadn't meant to speak at all. James turned his head slightly to glance at her. His expression was unreadable, but he didn't look surprised by the question. "Trapped?" She nodded. "I don't know how to explain it. I've been running from things for so long, running from life, from my own choices." She paused and looked down at her hands, her fingers tracing the patterns of frost on the glass. "I guess I thought coming out here would give me answers. but instead it feels like it's just made things more complicated. He simply watched her, as though he was weighing her words carefully. Then, after a long moment, he spoke in his calm, steady way. Sometimes we think running away will fix things, but all we're really doing is giving ourselves more time to think. The answers don't always come easily, and they don't always come when you want them. Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She had been running for so long. She had run from her past, from memories that haunted her, from decisions she couldn't take back. But standing here in this cabin with James beside her, she realized she wasn't sure she wanted to keep running anymore. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, an unspoken connection that seemed to fill the space around them. Evelyn could feel herself starting to trust him more, starting to believe in the calm, grounded way he saw the world. She wasn't used to having someone around who didn't judge. Someone who simply accepted her as she was. "I've never been good at staying put," she said, finally breaking the silence. "I've always had to be moving, always chasing something or running from it. But out here, with you, it's like I've been able to breathe for the first time in a long while." James glanced at her, his expression softening slightly. "Sometimes it takes a while to stop running. But when you do, you realize the things you've been searching for were never as far away as you thought." Evelyn felt something stir inside her, a flicker of hope. Or maybe it was just the idea of peace. She wasn't sure. All she knew was that being here, in this place, with James, felt like something real. Something she hadn't felt in a long time. "I don't know if I'm ready to leave," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what's waiting for me out there, and I'm scared of what I might find when I get back. But I also don't know if I'm ready to stay here either." James's gaze softened, and he took a step closer to her. "You don't have to make any decisions right away." "You've got time. Just because you think you have to leave doesn't mean you have to do it now. No one's pushing you out the door." Evelyn met his gaze, feeling a sense of comfort in his words. He wasn't pushing her. He wasn't rushing her to make a decision. He was simply giving her space to think, and in that moment Evelyn realized how much that meant. She had spent so long feeling like she had to hurry, like there was no time for pause, no time to breathe. But here, with James, there was time. Time to think. Time to heal. "Do you ever wonder what could have been if you'd made different choices?" she asked, turning to face him fully. She had never really asked anyone that before, but now, with James standing there, she felt like he might understand. James didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked down for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "Sometimes, but not always. You can't change the past. You can only learn from it, and try to make better choices moving forward." Evelyn took that in, feeling the truth of it settle in her heart. She had spent so much time regretting things she couldn't change, focusing on the past instead of the future. It was a hard habit to break, but maybe, just maybe, she was ready to try. "I guess I'm just scared," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Scared of what comes next. Scared that I'll make the wrong decision again." James nodded, as if he understood exactly how she felt. "Everyone's scared, Evelyn. The important thing is that you keep moving forward, even when it's hard. You'll make mistakes, sure, but that's how you learn. You don't have to be perfect, you just have to try." Evelyn felt something inside her shift. The weight on her chest didn't feel as heavy anymore. Maybe it wasn't about having all the answers. Maybe it was about moving forward, step by step, even when the road ahead was unclear. Maybe she didn't have to know everything, and maybe it was okay to take things one day at a time. As the night settled in around them, James and Evelyn sat by the fire, their conversation slowly fading into comfortable silence. Outside, the storm had stopped and the night sky was clearer than it had been in days. The world was still and peaceful, and in that stillness Evelyn felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Hope for the future. Hope for a life where she didn't have to keep running, where she could face whatever came next with strength and courage. For the first time in a long while, Evelyn didn't feel lost, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The next morning, the world outside was transformed. The snowstorm had passed, and the sky was clear, revealing a vast, snowy landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft golden light over the mountains and valleys. It was quiet, utterly still, except for the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. The ranch, usually so isolated and stark in winter, now seemed to glow with a new sense of possibility. Everything from the trees to the frozen pond seemed to hold a secret, as if waiting for something new to begin. Evelyn stood by the window, gazing out at the world she had come to know over the past few days. Her thoughts were heavy, a mixture of uncertainty and reluctant acceptance. It was time to leave, but part of her didn't want to. She didn't want to leave the quiet of this place, the peacefulness of the cabin, and most of all, she didn't want to leave James. James had given her space to think, as he always did. He didn't push her, didn't demand that she make a decision, but Evelyn knew that she couldn't stay in the cabin forever. She had to face the world outside, with all its noise and chaos, but she also knew that she wasn't the same person who had arrived here days ago. Something inside her had changed, something deep and unspoken. She heard the sound of footsteps behind her. James walked in, his figure framed by the doorway, his presence calm and steady. He had always seemed at ease with the quiet, but there was something different about him today. Something that told Evelyn he understood what this moment meant for her. "You're up early," he said, his voice low and warm. Evelyn turned to face him, offering a small smile. "I couldn't sleep," she said, her eyes drifting back to the window. "Just thinking about everything." James nodded, as though he understood exactly what she meant. He walked over and stood beside her, looking out at the view. The stillness of the moment felt comfortable, like a shared silence that didn't need words. "You ready to go?" he asked, his voice gentle, but there was an edge of something else in his tone. A question that didn't need to be asked, but one he knew had to be. Evelyn hesitated, the weight of the question settling deep in her chest. She didn't know. She wasn't ready, but she knew she couldn't stay here forever, not without making a choice. There was a future waiting for her, a life she had to step back into, no matter how uncertain it felt. But still, the thought of leaving was hard. "I don't know," she said softly. "It's just hard to leave after everything." James glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "Leaving doesn't mean you're running away from what you found here. It just means you're taking what you've learned and moving forward." Evelyn looked at him, and for the first time she realized how much he had shaped her understanding of the world. His quiet strength, his steady presence had given her the space to reflect on her life and what she wanted from it. She didn't have all the answers, and she didn't expect to. But she had learned something important from James, that it was okay to be uncertain, that it was okay to move forward even when you didn't know exactly where you were going. "I know," she said, her voice steady now, though there was a sadness in her words. "But it feels like I'm leaving a part of myself behind." James turned toward her, his eyes soft. "You're not leaving anything behind. You're taking everything you've learned with you." Evelyn nodded, feeling the truth of his words sink in. She had spent so much time running, so much time avoiding the reality of her life, that she had forgotten how to face it. But now, with James's quiet wisdom and the calm of this place, she could see a path forward. Not a perfect one, but a path nonetheless. After a few moments of silence, she looked up at him again, her gaze meeting his.
"Thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity.
"For everything. I don't know what I would have done without you." Ideas gave her a small smile, but there was something in his eyes, something warm and unspoken. "You would have found your way," he said simply. "You're stronger than you think." Evelyn smiled back, though her heart felt heavy. She wasn't sure she was ready to leave, but she knew she had to. She couldn't stay here, wrapped in the safety of the cabin forever. The world outside was waiting for her, and it was time to face it. "I guess it's time to go," she said, her voice steady now, though there was a bittersweet edge to it. James nodded, his gaze shifting to the door. "I'll help you get ready," he said, turning toward the small pile of supplies he had gathered for her: food, water, and a warm coat for the journey ahead. Evelyn followed him, her mind still a swirl of emotions. The thought of leaving, of stepping back into a world that had always seemed too big, too loud, made her nervous. But she knew she couldn't stay here forever, living in this small, quiet world. She had to take what she had learned and find her own way. She packed her things quietly, her hands moving in a blur as she stuffed the last of the supplies into the bag. James worked beside her, moving with the same calm efficiency that had defined his days here. There was something reassuring about the way he moved, like he was always prepared for whatever came next, no matter how uncertain. It was a quality Evelyn admired, one that she hoped would stay with her as she stepped back into the world. When they were finished, James stood by the door waiting for her. Evelyn took a deep breath and glanced at him one last time. She wasn't sure what she would find when she left, but she felt more prepared than she had in a long time. "Well, I guess this is it," she said, her voice soft. James nodded, his eyes steady. "You take care of yourself out there." Evelyn smiled, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I will. And thank you for everything." With that, she turned toward the door, the cold air rushing in as she stepped outside. The world was still, the air crisp, and the snow crunched beneath her boots. She glanced back at James, who stood in the doorway watching her with a steady gaze. For a moment she wanted to turn around, to go back inside and stay with him in the warmth of the cabin. But she knew she couldn't. She had to go. With one last look, she turned away and began walking down the path that led to the edge of the ranch, where the world beyond awaited. The snow beneath her feet crunched with each step, and though the world felt vast and cold, she felt a quiet strength rising inside her. She wasn't alone anymore. She had James's quiet wisdom with her, and the lessons she had learned here in this small, peaceful world. As she walked away from the cabin, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light on the snow. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, Evelyn didn't feel lost. She was ready to face whatever came next.